All right. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our webinar, Commodity Detections versus Behavioral, the difference that can save your organization. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded, and we will be sending out a recording to everyone who registered. We will be answering questions through and at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to type your questions into the GoToWebinar questions section. And now a little bit about Binary Defense before we jump in. Binary Defense is a managed security services provider and software developer with proprietary cybersecurity solutions that include SOC as a service, Forrester leading managed detection and response, security information and event management, threat hunting, and counterintelligence. With our human-driven technology-assisted approach, Binary Defense is able to provide clients with immediate protection and visibility, combating and stopping the next generation of attacks that businesses face. Our presenter for today is Binary Defense co-founder and CTO David Kennedy, and I'll go ahead and hand the presentation over to him.
Awesome, thanks so much. And pleasure to speak to everybody today and appreciate you hopping on. Dave Kennedy, founder and CTO of Binary Defense. And today we're gonna be talking about commodity versus behavioral. And these are one of the things, this is one of my most favorite things to talk about, because when you look at most organizations that we go into, from a binary defense perspective, we get to see organizations at varying different levels of maturity. And the trust tech side, from a offensive red teaming capability and penetration testing and everything else in between, we get to see different levels of organizations. And the biggest thing that we see for most companies and organizations is that it's really difficult for them to go from commodity to behavioral. And I'll talk about what that means. But most organizations are still at a point, an inflection point within their organization where they don't know their controls. They don't know how effective they are when compared to other adversaries that may be wanting to target them, or what their threat models are. They don't know which technologies provide what coverage, and that lack of understanding creates a lot of complexity, both for your security strategy as well as what you're doing as an organization to continuously adopt new techniques that are coming out, or new types of detections. And you look at kind of the industry as a whole and where we started from to where we're at today. A lot's changed. Our focus is less on trying to protect everything, which is still a great goal to have. You want to have as much preventative mechanisms as possible, but our goal is, if we can identify a threat earlier on in the earlier stages of an attack versus latter stages around exfiltration and other areas, we have a much better position to defend our company and reduce the amount of damage that we have out there. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do: reduce the risk to our business, remove the amount of time that an attacker has in our environment, and really try to respond much more effectively to organizations, or to specific threats and attacks. And so when we talk about commodity versus behavioral, every organization is unique to yourself. Every organization is either 20 years old or 30 years old, or just starting up. Might be cloud centric, might be on premise, might be a mixture of hybrid. You're all over the place. The technologies that we use, how the infrastructure was designed, the legacy systems that we have to deal with, new business operations that we're dealing with, expansion, acquisitions. There's a lot of complexities that make up our technology footprint and the risks that we have as an organization, including demographics of the type of businesses we're in. Are we in the financial sector? Are we medical? What are we doing from a critical infrastructure? There's all these different components that make up, a very complex model of different things that we have to defend our organizations day in and day out. And ultimately, we have to be able to move very fast and very nimble to be able to understand what threats we have towards our organization, and new threats that may be emerging out there as we go along. We'll be talking about that as we go through today. One housekeeping item: feel free to ask any questions that you want to on the questions tab down here and onto GoToWebinar. If you also hear my dogs barking, I have two crazy boxers that bark at literally leaves blowing across the way. So if you hear them, I apologize. Still perks from working from home. But feel free to answer questions or ask questions. Be happy to answer them either throughout the presentation, or as I'm towards the very end, I'll go through definitely some of the Q&A areas that we have here. But just a brief introduction myself. I've been in the information security space for over 22 years. Started my career off working for the National Security Agency and in the intelligence community in the Marine Corps. Did 2 tours in Iraq. Got out and have been everything from a chief security officer for a Fortune 1000 company where I ran their global information security program and physical security as the chief security officer for them for a number of years. And then got out and started my own 2 companies, Trust and Second Binary Defense. I've been fortunate. I'm in the news quite frequently. I do all of the different news organizations. been testified in front of Congress on a number of occasions. I'm very technical in nature. I've written a number of open exploitation frameworks and defensive tools. So my whole passion has always been cybersecurity and really trying to help folks get better with security and helping organizations get better with security. Also co-authored the book Metasploit: The Penetration Tester's Guide, testified in front of Congress, and helped out with the TV show Mr. Robot, which was awesome. Got to work with Rami Malek and Christian Slater. And a little fun fact, I've also been in a Chris Brown rap video. So I was in the back hacking away into a cell phone, apparently. That was the whole skit of the thing itself. Never thought that would happen, being in a music video growing up as a kid, but hey, it happened. And being a computer nerd, I guess, is pretty cool. But getting into it, talking about some of the challenges today. When we look at adversary capabilities, it's very different today than it was 5 years ago, as it was 10 years ago, as it was 15 years ago. And the evolution of these different groups is different, right? You look at capabilities of ransomware groups, for example, which is obviously the hot button topic. The thing with ransomware is that it's industry agnostic. If you're looking at threat models towards your organization, most organizations don't fit the bill for nation state capabilities. Some do, but not everybody. And when you look at that and you say, okay, well, I'm not in the nation state category. What are my risk factors that I have to deal with from a capabilities perspective of all of these different groups that are out there? And so ransomware is predominantly going to be in pretty much everybody's risk model, depending on different groups, but different groups target different industries. Some of them are all over the place. It just depends. But when you look at ransomware as a whole, what's changed with those types of organizations is that 10 years ago they were so rudimentary, and it all kind of stems from like the credit card / Carter market, where you had all these big breaches like Home Depot, Jimmy John's, obviously Target, and all of these different breaches that occurred a number of years ago. And the retail space went to point of sale encryption, so the device itself, hardware-based encryption, which cut out a big part of that organized crime group's ability to harvest large amounts of credit card data. And so you had this kind of shift towards ransomware, which was really non-sophisticated attacks targeting individuals, grandpas and grandmas that were less sophisticated. Not saying all grandpas and grandmas are less sophisticated, just in general, the demographics of population, less technology sophisticated individuals. Ransomware was kind of birthed out of that industry. And we started seeing more and more revenue going to these organizations. And I was actually really wrong a number of years ago on this specific topic, because I thought ransomware was really going to be a fad, a phase. And what I didn't realize is that the ransomware groups were going to continuously invest in their own capabilities and increase their sophistication as time went along, and then eventually morph into things like we see like ransomware as a service, which is interesting, right? So now you have more sophisticated, and I use sophisticated loosely. A lot of these groups aren't super amazing at what they do, but they're more sophisticated than a lot of the hacker population out there. So they continuously improve their code. They have a number of different people that purchase their services, or at least have a cut or share of the impact that they have to organizations from a ransomware perspective, and they model that out, and they're making a ton of money off of it. And the techniques themselves change drastically over time. There's a new variant of Ryuk out. You look at what happened with Emotet. Granted the group's done now, but the sophistication levels have continuously changing different ransomware groups. And we just have these different groups that change their what we call their tactics, techniques, and procedures on a regular basis. And it's very difficult for organizational security models to be able to handle that fluid nature of attack. And if we're all in this demographic of ransomware, we have to look at those threats and say, well, how do we as an organization validate that we're protected against these specific groups? Do we know that our technology that we purchase, whether it's an EDR product or an endpoint protection product, or our firewalls or sandbox and virtualization technology or web content filtering, a web application firewall, whatever it ends up being, are these controls working? Are they valid? And do we have protection against them? And when you look at that, most organizations don't have those abilities. Maybe they've gone through a penetration test. Maybe they have a SIM. Maybe they have an EDR product. But that's a commodity level. That is a basic level of understanding around security, your organization, and what's actually occurring in your environment. And it takes more than implementing a product or a piece of technology to get to a point to where you actually have a functional monitoring and detection program that can actually respond to specific threats, identify them, and boot attackers out. A lot of times products may log the information, may log these specific attacks that are happening out there, but it requires a person to intelligently go through them or to go through the data itself and say, this is unusual in our environment. We need to respond to these, to look at these. And that's really when we get to the behavior side of things. Your organization is unique. Your organization has different users, different populations. You might be a global company. You might be Midwestern. You might be, East Coast or West Coast. All those things make up a unique organization that changes day to day. And if we don't understand our organization, don't understand the behavior that our organization exhibits on a regular basis, there's no way you're going to know what's normal and what's not. You're going to hope that something hits a signature, which is what most of these tools are today, so that you can respond effectively to a specific threat. There's no validation occurring for how well you're doing against these specific types of attacks. And so when we look at that and we say, okay, let's understand where we're at today, companies vastly struggle with maturing their organization, especially around monitoring detection, because, for one, from a monitoring detection perspective, you need to understand who your adversaries are in those threat models. You need to understand their capabilities. And it's not just a one-time shot type of thing. This is a continuously evolving area that we need to have continual focus on. And if you look at what's happening out there today, most organizations are drastically unprepared to handle those types of attacks. You look at some of the things that are coming out around Colonial Pipeline. This could have happened to any organization. There was a lot of mockery happening out there as things do. Oh, this company got owned and they weren't doing security appropriately. These breaches can happen to anybody out there today. You look at the attacks specifically around Colonial. I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing about all these big name breaches, but I'm going to go into this one specifically. They found a old VPN concentrator that didn't have multi-factor authentication on it. But the interesting part about that specific attack is that when this was a targeted attack against an organization where the attackers used a methodical approach of enumerating users, looking at data breach data, comparing notes, doing credential stuffing, trying to authenticate to various systems, found a system that didn't have multi-factor authentication, got in through the VPN concentrator, and then from there moved laterally across the environment to maximize the amount of damage they had. And we see this time and time again where these adversaries are getting much better at that, where they compromise one user through phishing, or they get in through a web application, they get in through misconfigurations. And that initial entry point, once they have that initial access, they start to grow their access over and over and over again to other systems until they maximize the amount of damage, going for backups, going for your server infrastructure, going through for workstations. All of these things are things that we need to be concerned about from a threat model perspective. And again, we're never going to be perfect on prevention, but we have to be able to identify when a breach occurs on that initial entry point or as the other stages of an attack occur. That's why I like something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, because they break down, multiple phases of an attack and say, listen, this is what initial access looks like. This is what privilege escalation looks like. This is what lateral movement looks like. This is what exfiltration looks like. All these different phases, we can start to build an understanding around what controls we have in place, either preventative or detective, that can allow us to respond much more effectively to that. Again, moving beyond commodity. And there's a big difference between what we call emulation and simulation. The big question is, when you look at emulation, emulation is going through previously known attacks, what we call tactics, techniques, and procedures, and emulating those attacks to see how effective we compare against those. And that's important, especially to understand, if you look at something like MITRE ATT&CK, you go to the group section, you grab all the ransomware groups, and you say, okay, well, what are their techniques and the procedures that they use? Map those to our specific technologies that we have to see if we actually have good coverage and effectiveness there. And there's a big difference between coverage and effectiveness. Coverage is just a binary, 1 or 0. Do we have coverage in this area that we can detect something like this? Yes or no? Yes. Well, how effective is that detection? You look at something like process injection, for example. There's 8 or 9 different techniques for process injection, including process hollowing and a number of other techniques. How effective are we at identifying each and every one of those types of process injections? Because those are potential avenues that an attacker is going to use in our environment. We start to build this list of our controls to say, hey, we have great detection here. We have very little detection here. And it starts to prioritize how you start to look at your infrastructure, your organization, your strategy, and everything else that you do from a security perspective, because it's actually validating the controls that you have in place in your environment. And most organizations don't go through those types of exercises. And that's a major problem that we face today, because our reliance on technology and tooling becomes a major issue when it comes to how fast these organizations move and how fast they retool and change their infrastructure to go after organizations even more. So again, most organizations at a basic level of protection, when it comes to how do you actually identify this, and we have to be able to move fast. And our ultimate goal really needs to be prevention. Like in a perfect world, if we could prevent everything, that's great. The problem with prevention, though, is that it takes a long time. I don't know any organization that can implement a preventative feature overnight or as an attack occurs, unless it's cataclysmic. If you look at something like Hafnium, for example, where we had exchange servers with a 0-day being popped, that if you had an on-premise exchange infrastructure. Okay, something like that is obviously going to be something that we can down our exchange infrastructure with because it's an immediate threat towards our organization. When we look at preventative strategies, like for example, let's just say we decide to do application control, or allow listing. That's going to be a large effort that we have to do because we have to baseline our environment. We have to understand our exceptions. We have to have consistency across our standardization around our images. There's a lot of things that go into preventing specific things. And if we have to add a new preventative control, it takes time. We have to test it. We have to go through QA. We have to go through change control. We have to roll it out slowly. Prevention takes a long time. And this is really where detection has to take that step forward and be agile and fast. And that's where most organizations get hung up on is the traditional security operations center versus moving fast. So security operations centers, traditionally, alarm comes in, you review the alarm. Most of the time, 99% of the time, it's a false positive. It goes away, false positive, goes away, false positive, goes away. And you just do a cyclical effect over and over again until that one thing actually happens and you're responding to it, right? The problem with the security operations center is that you absolutely have to have that. And it's a reactionary force on your eyes and ears of what's going on in there. But you also have to have detection engineering. You have to have the ability to say, what are the new threats that are happening out there, areas that we have gaps in, and we have to be able to move very fast to get those detections in place so that we ensure that we have them in our organization to be able to identify them. Let's take a look at Colonial and JBS. So you look at Revel and you look at DarkSide, which DarkSide is non-operational at the moment. Who knows? Probably spin back up in another week or two. But you look at that and you say, okay, well, what were the specific indicators used in those types of attacks? Because they're in our threat model. Let's take a look of the breakdown and analysis from our threat intelligence sources or from what's public out there that's been released, and let's see how good we are when compared to these types of attacks, and how fast can we get new detections put into place so that we have good coverage and effectiveness over those different areas. That should be a lickety split fast area where we're investigating those as they're coming out and as new data is coming in. This is a continuously evolving field where we're trying to understand what these adversaries are doing. You look at Russia, for example, and SolarWinds. While you're probably not going to be able to detect the specific supply chain attack that happened, that's very difficult to do. You look at the post-exploitation scenarios that they were using, most specifically around WMI. Russia loves WMI. Do we have coverage in things like WMIC and WMI intrinsic and extrinsic values? Can we identify those in our environment of suspicious WMI queries that are potentially persistence footholds, command and control, or other ways of doing things in our environment? Do we have coverage and effectiveness there if that's in our threat model for high likelihood or high probability? We have to have a very fast workflow of being able to conduct emulations, detection engineering to production, and benchmark those and view those as it's going along. That's really the evolution of monitoring detection. It's not buy a SIM, implement it, hope everything's good, slap some people on it, and we're good to go. It's an evolution of continuously improving how things are going out there. And here's the thing: products and technology are great. And this is not a knock. There's some great products out there and some great technologies out there, but they're for the masses. They're for everybody. So these are going to be your commodity detections. You're going to have one-to-one type detections when a new attack is seen in the wild. Hopefully that organization is up to speed on it, and hopefully they're implementing that new specific attack as it's going in there. But what makes something commodity versus behavioral is making it our own. Behavioral is something specific to our organization that is unusual patterns of behavior. For example, I love PowerShell, right? I claim the fame. I gave the very first ever PowerShell security talk with one of my good friends, Josh Kelly, and it was at DEF CON. I think it was like DEF CON 12. And it was when PowerShell was first coming out. It was in beta, had not been implemented in any operating system yet. And we went on stage and we're like, listen, if PowerShell makes it into the operating system as a default, which obviously it did, it's in Windows 10 and everything else, and it was in Windows 8 and above, or Windows 7 and above. Those are the things. It's going to be one of the most attacked programming languages because it is very powerful. It's going to be both used for offense and defense. And lo and behold, it came true. But PowerShell is a great example because PowerShell is used consistently across the board, across every organization for patches, for applications, for metrics, for reporting, for custom applications, you name it. PowerShell has taken over the Windows operating system, as it should. It's a phenomenal resource. But we should understand what is going on in our environment from a PowerShell perspective. Now, a lot of tools from a commodity perspective will look at PowerShell and say, okay, we're going to look for things like invoke expression, encoded command. We're going to look for virtual alloc or kernel32.dll or all these different potential indicators that could bubble up something suspicious. But what if an attacker's not using that? We commonly see attackers leveraging PowerShell that aren't using any of those methods whatsoever and completely get around those commodity detections because, again, they're not your own. So the difference between commodity and behavioral is saying, listen, let's take a look at all PowerShell commands in our environment and let's baseline what's normal, what's not. And you can whittle this down quite a bit. You can say, okay, if it is a normal user, which, a normal user, not a domain admin, not, maybe a web development team, maybe not, certain types of groups within your organization that are going to be technical and potentially using PowerShell. Let's look at if it's a regular user and they're leveraging PowerShell and it has network communications, let's take a look at that and bubble up to an analyst. And then let's put exceptions in place for normal business use cases where they're potentially using PowerShell and look for deviations of that traffic. That is a good behavior detection. I'm not saying you can I would like to eliminate the network communications part of it because that could be potentially abused, but that will still catch most of the stuff out there. But that is a great detection because now it's to your own. You're looking for anomalies. You're looking for things that might not leverage evoke expression or IEX or encoded command or things like that. So we have the ability to look for things that are abnormal that are based on us. And there's a whole lot of different types of ways of looking at that, and a whole bunch of different use cases that we'll get into around focusing on behavior aspects around what's unique to your organization versus not. So when we talk about emulation, I've walked into a number of organizations that are in what I would consider an advanced state. There's not many. And I would say I can count them on one hand. It's probably less than 5. And when we talk about an advanced state, these are organizations that have taken it to the next level by understanding what technologies they have, by having offense, i.e. the red side of the house, the red teaming side, or the offensive security folks, focus on not just the traditional covert operations, which in most cases, I'll be perfectly honest with you, covert testing is such an overused play in this industry. It really needs to be more overt testing, so you have that balance between red and blue and coming up with how an actual attack chain works and building detections in place. But the red is less focused on owning the organization and finding as many flaws as possible, and more so on the detection engineering side of the house of working with blue to run through assume breach type situations where you establish code execution. Okay, so we got remote code execution onto a system. What does that look like? And then what are the stages that happens afterwards? Let's test 5 or 10 or 15 different emulation plans to run through these and how effective we are at identifying those. And are there ways of us circumventing our current detections? That's where you start to get into a very strong stance. Now, we've seen, I'll talk about the advanced, one on one hand. Some of the folks that I've seen have taken it to the next level, not just focus on the detection engineering side of it, but also on the detection automation side. So taking it from a step of, okay, well, we wrote these detections, but also let's test that these detections are actually working on a daily basis. So not only do we build a detection, but we also build a test case around that as well to ensure that all of our detections are continuously working over time. And then we have that cyclical effect and loop of how you actually go and do it. And then education awareness to our security analysts saying, hey, here's new detections that we wrote. Here's the impact of those. And here's the things that we need to focus on in our environment so we can continuously get better and we can educate our SOC analysts around what specific attacks look like. Because to be honest with you, a lot of these attacks are the story that you tell, the story that the attacker's telling. So if an attacker wants to tell the story that he's legitimate or she's legitimate, then going through certain types of ways of attacking an organization is very possible, and trying to craft a story that if a security analyst sees it still is believable. But if you teach analysts unusual behavior within your environment and what that looks like and what lateral movement looks like, for example, those are all key things that can be trained to a SOC analyst if they know what to look for. And so a lot of these attacks, may come off, fairly legitimate. Some of them look heavily obfuscated, encrypted, and are definitely like, hey, this is something that's wrong. We need to investigate this right away. But it comes down to training as well. So that whole loop aside of being able to continuously test, continuously implement, and to continuously ensure that we're trained ensures that you have a lot of controls in place around all the different phases of an attack, not just one specific one. And look in the case of Colonial, the first thing that the piece of malware did when it detonated was disable their endpoint protection software. And that's all the controls they had. So everything else went out the window. So now the controls that they completely relied upon, which is the prevention piece, gone. Now all the other phases of attack completely went undetected until it was too late, right? And that's the type of position that we do not want to be at in any organization. We really want to focus on understanding where we're at today. And what I really like about validating your controls and mapping it to something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework is that you can have a different discussion with executives and leadership around how your program is doing. When you can say, listen, based on our threat models, here's the groups, and by the way, here's a debrief of these groups and who they are. People love that. They're like, this group is operating out of Russia, this is out of China, this is out of this place. These groups do this. This is what they focus on. Here's the people that they've targeted. Here's why we're in this specific industry vertical. We've seen them before. They targeted us. That stuff is cool just to talk about from a communication perspective. But then you say, well, listen, all of these investments that we made right here, and here's the specific adversary groups that are on target. Here's how well we do. We're 80% covered with a 70% effectiveness against these specific attacks. And now you start to paint a picture of, well, in order for us to get to 80 or 90, here's the things that we need to do better. We need to hire in these areas. We need to do this. We need to do that. It starts a different discussion around how do you continuously build out and develop the strategy to progress your monitoring and detection forward so that you can get better at what you do. And that's ultimately what we're here to do, is communicate risk and to explain to organizations, these are the ways that we get better as things go along, and to be able to demonstrate and show those impacts as your program continues. Now, supply chain attacks are something that are a little bit different, right? Because this completely throws a wrench in our whole model around trust factors with our third parties and our trusted providers. You look at something like SolarWinds, for example, where they were able to get into the code repository and push updates out to their customers. That's a very difficult one to look at, and that's very targeted. We don't see a whole lot of those, but one thing I can tell you is that when you look at the success that Russia had specifically with SolarWinds, allegedly Russia had with SolarWinds, a lot of other adversaries, both organized crime and nation states, are looking at this saying, well, heck, if I can get access to one, provider of a software as a service platform, or, someone that has on-premise solutions that has high level of access, not only can I impact one organization, I can impact thousands of organizations now and have a much better impact from a, intellectual property theft perspective or ransomware perspective. So, supply chain attacks are ones that we are definitely monitoring and very concerned with, because it is one of the hardest ones to detect. A couple of things to understand about the breakdown of defenses in a supply chain attack. What's interesting about SolarWinds specifically is that when you saw a number of these large organizations get compromised, you look at it, it was Microsoft, Cisco, VMware, Intel, a number of these big organizations that have obviously massive security programs and things that they do. One of the things that I found very interesting is that when you saw the update mechanism hit, right? So when the SolarWinds bad code got pushed out to the customers, what happened there is that it was then executed, the services started, and SolarWinds launched, and that code itself was then executed on the system itself. What happened is that on the customer systems that were impacted, the servers had to reach out from that server infrastructure out to the internet, right? So it had to communicate out to a command and control infrastructure, and it had to beacon out to the internet and say, listen, I need to establish a command and control with you right now. Now, in that specific case, if we were doing good security practices, our server infrastructure and our server farm should never, ever, 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 ever have direct access to the internet. We should put exceptions in place to allow it for update mechanisms or handle it through our third-party patch management process, but we should never be allowing servers ever direct access, especially to unknown systems that it hasn't communicated before in the past. That's prevention key number one for supply chain attacks. And if you look at historically things like NotPetya, for example, and a number of the other ones, not allowing updates directly to specific locations would have a major impact in protecting your server infrastructure specifically from supply chain attacks. So that's one specific area there. Second, with supply chain attacks, we have to look at our infrastructure and architecture and say, listen, from inside out, we also have to architect our design to minimize the amount of damage. Does SolarWinds really need access to domain admin level accounts? Does it need access to all these infrastructures? Can we limit ports and protocols? Can we minimize the amount of damage that something like this has as we start to go along? All things that we can kind of look at from that side. Now, the biggest piece on a lot of this is, monitoring detection. Look at some of the attacks that happened post-exploitation wise from a SolarWinds perspective. WMI exploitation, PowerShell, things to that effect. Those are things that we can look at from a post-initial access perspective from an attack chain and say, listen, these are the things that we can identify in our environment from an unusual activity. Why is our servers, when they've never used WMIC before in the past from a regular context user account or a system account, why are they using WMIC? Why are they issuing commands? Why are they doing persistence footholds? Why are they doing command and control? These are all things that we can identify in our environment if we do appropriate testing and baselining and making things our own. Hands down, I'm not aware of any technology that was out there that detected SolarWinds, except if you focused on behavior. Again, why are we using these types of commands when they haven't been used before in the past? Those are all key things that we focus on as we go along. So the first thing that organizations really should look at is their overall threat model. Who are the attackers that want to have access to our infrastructure, and what are their capabilities from an adversary perspective? That's the first question you should be asking yourself in general. What is our threat model? Who are the adversaries that want to go after us? And then, do we have coverage and effectiveness in those different areas to build those out? If we don't know, then we're not going to be able to intelligibly say whether or not we can defend these types of attacks, or even if we have the ability to respond to these specific types of attacks. Those are all things that we have to look at as we go about. And again, detection is so paramount, especially in something like the Sunburst attack. I just want to say Starburst because I love Starburst. But when you look at Sunburst specifically, there's a lot of stages here that could happen. Hafnium, exact same things that occur out there. We just got a question really quick. Will these slides be available? Yeah, this whole session's recorded, and all the slides we'll make sure is available to everybody. So no sweat there. But you look at the types of detections post-exploitation wise, we may not be able to detect the 0 day that's being used. I wouldn't expect anybody to detect the 0 day. But as you start to look at the post-exploitation scenarios around process injection, around lateral movement, around privilege escalation, persistence, there's so many different things that if we build coverage and effectiveness in all those different areas, we have an extremely high likelihood of identifying them in some of those phases to boot those attackers out without even knowing the initial exploitation method that they got entry into. Obviously, that's something we have to do from an incident response perspective and move back into things. So those are all key things that we'll kind of walk into. So some of the examples of solid detections. Baselining PowerShell for execution. What's normal, what's not? I talked about that one specifically, right? What does normal PowerShell execution look like in our environment, and what does abnormal execution look like? I always remember a story. This is a binary defense customer, and when they first came on board, they installed our MDR product, which looks at PowerShell execution in all aspects. And the first time they installed it, literally at 2 a.m., one of our security analysts got an alert, and it was a PowerShell encoded command. And if you took apart the encoded command, which is, if you're not familiar with encoded command, it's a way of taking your application, you cast the Unicode base64 encode, and then you can pass it, which circumvents what are called execution restriction policies, which allows you to restrict PowerShell execution. And we saw this happening, and if you tear apart the base64 encoder, it was using invoke expression to go and download a binary from China at 2 o'clock in the morning. And the code itself was obfuscated. It used shellcode injection, so it used virtual alloc to allocate memory of this application or binary to load it directly into memory, and beaconing out to China. And this is, first thing you install, you see this, and all of a sudden now you're like, hey, we just proved our technology right here, right now. We got an attacker. They've already been compromised. This is going to be awesome. We're high-fiving each other. I get the call and I'm all excited. And turns out they contracted with a third-party development company out of China to do exchange metrics, because this was on their exchange server. And so the coders of this specific thing used very similar techniques that an attacker would to basically pull down. If you tore apart the binary, literally all it was doing was grabbing exchange log data and piping it back to the server to parse it and produce pretty graphs. But those are things that you want to know that are happening in your environment, right? You want to baseline that type of activity and say, okay, well, that's I guess normal. I still don't consider that normal, but it's acceptable, I guess, in the case of that business case, and be able to deviate from those and then look at what other things are happening in your environment. So can we identify things that are PowerShell in our environment? And another good question too, you talk about preventative. Again, preventative is always going to be the best, right? We want preventative first, and then we want detective second, but the detective always usually comes first because it's faster to implement. But when you look at PowerShell specifically, preventative, can we disallow regular users from executing PowerShell in the first place and altogether remove that attack surface? I'm not saying your admins or your developers, your systems administrators, or Exchange admins or whatever, they probably still need PowerShell. But can we disallow Bob and Sales? Does Bob and Sales need a full-fledged programming language at their fingertips? Probably not. They probably don't need that. So we can limit the amount of access that our users have, reducing our attack surface and kind of going from there, right? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is reduce the noise, reduce the attack surface, get better detections in place, and look at what we have here. Another area is baselining what we call living off the land binaries and scripts. If you're not familiar with living off the land binaries and scripts, these are legitimate applications that are built into Windows, into Linux, into OS X or Mac that are code signed by the providers. It could be a third party, it could be Microsoft or whomever, that have additional functionality. There's a great website called lawbass.project.io, I think. It's run by one of our folks over on the TrustedSec side, Odvar Mo, and a number of his folks that run that. And if you go to that site, you can see a number of applications that are legitimate applications that have additional functionality in it. For example, code signing, or code sign applications that have things like download and execute functionality, the ability to execute code remotely, download things. There's a whole bunch of ones that are out there that do this, like MSHTA, RegSVR32, CBD, CSE, Mav inject, Run DLL32, all of these different areas. All these different binaries and applications that are installed by default on your operating system that have the ability for remote code execution, or download and execute functionality, or alternate data streams. There's a whole bunch of different ones. And this has been traditionally used heavier and heavier and heavier by more adversaries that are out there, because it usually evades a lot of the traditional detections. And here's an example of commodity versus behavior. On the left-hand side here, we can see that we call RegSVR32. Now, if you Google abusing RegSVR32, you can see here that it's doing a /s/n/u/i, and it's going out to a specific website to download what's called a scriptlet object. And a scriptlet object is just a native language that is being parsed by the serobj.dll DLL that's in the system32 directory. And notice here, if we just copy and paste that specific attack, we can see here on the left-hand side that Windows Defender automatically shuts it down and says, hey, this is a threat. And this is what we consider a commodity, because it's what an attacker could potentially use that has been previously defined before in the past. But if I'm in any way, shape, or form crafty at all, I can just take that and split that up into two different commands using something like bitsadmin, which is another law bin for downloading applications, or downloading a specific file. You can use wget, you can use Excel. There's a number of different ways of downloading stuff. But when you look at the bitsadmin, it'll go in to download a specific file, which is our test.txt, which contains our malicious scriptlet object, which in this case, it's just doing launching calc.exe to demonstrate remote code execution. And then here we call RegSVR32. We completely circumvent that detection criteria built into Windows Defender, which is a commodity detection, which is where most of the tools are at. And we've completely gotten around that preventative mechanism and detective mechanism on that system, and are able to then, completely use that specific attack vector without having any type of detection. So this is where we have to look and continuously test in our environment to say, well, if we have preventive controls, we feel assured there, it's great. Let's continuously test that and then continue to build better detections in place. Good detection for this one, by the way, if we go back to this really quick, excuse me, is if we have a good example would be to query your data, and if you're capturing logs through either Sysmon or another way of log collection, if your EDR products, look at this. Process creation is a good one. In querying your data and saying, hey, if a regular user ever creates process creation, send me an alert. And let's look at that historically. If you have good data going back 30, 60, 90 days, et cetera, the chances are that you're not going to see Reg SVR32 ever executed by a regular user in the first place. 9 times out of 10, I haven't personally seen it in a lot of organizations. So, a good detection would be anytime Reg SVR32 is ever executed in the first place, or bits admin from the context of a regular user account, that's probably something I want to investigate or even prevent. Again, prevention is key in this one. That would shut down this attack completely. We don't even care. We don't want Reg SVR32 ever executing from the context of a regular user account. Operating system may use it. That's fine. It's going to be run from the system account itself. Fantastic. But regular user context should never see this type of thing. And again, that's just one example. There's MSHTA, MAB-inject, CBD, CSC, as I mentioned before. RunDLL32 is a commonly abused one. Just recently, the most recent specific attack that was tied back to the same adversary group used from the SolarWinds side of the house, allegedly out of Russia. They would mount an ISO file. That ISO file would then call RunDLL32, which would import a specific file for remote code execution. Then it would use scheduled tasks in PowerShell and a few other things. Again, these are all things that, yes, it's a targeted, sophisticated adversary, but the techniques that they're using are all things that we should be able to identify if we're just baselining our environment. Again, none of the tools were detecting that because it's commodity detections. They change their attack in their environment, to get around the tools that you have that are commodity. And again, if we just had an understanding of our environment, we'd have a much better position to actually go and identify these. Some other ones, I could literally spend my entire life looking through parent-child process relationships. If I have process creation and a process tree for every process on a system, I could literally spend hours and hours and days and days and days looking at that. When Outlook.exe or Export.exe kicks, which is going to be spawned on the context of user account, spawns a child process of Outlook.exe, which spawns a child process of Excel.exe, which spawns a child process of PowerShell.exe. Those are things that I want to look at, right? Those are unusual indicators that I typically shouldn't see in an environment that I could potentially look at. And so parent-child process relationships are some of the most fruitful things that I can see out there. Reg SVR32 is a great example. Why do you see Export.exe with any other child processes of Reg SVR32 or MSHT or any other law bin? RunDLL32 is another great example. Those are all key things that you can identify directly with that. And then couple that with things like, hey, do any of those have network communications? CertUtil is a commonly abused living off the land where you can use CertUtil to download a file. Why is CertUtil ever having network communications? You never see CertUtil. It's used for importing and exporting certificates, usually by an administrator on the command line side of the house. You don't see it typically ever have network communications. So these are all things that we can look at, right? DNS is a great one. You can look at time-based beacon intervals with that. You can look at unusual sites, comparing it to things like the Alexa top 1 million, which ones fall outside of that we can look at, things that might indicate potential compromises. Persistent footholds, scheduled tasks, registry modifications. These are all areas for persistence footholds. Process injection, again, there's like 8 or 9 different techniques, especially things like LSAS. Another example, if you look at something like Defender ATP, or you look at other products, typically if you're injected into the WRFault process, you can use WRFault then to inject into LSAS, completely go undetected, because WRFault is a common process that injects into LSAS for specific areas, commonly known abused path, again, moving from commodity to behavior. WMI is also a major area. Russia uses WMI hands in, hands out quite a bit. Command line usage, any command line usage. Why is a user doing net user / domain? Why is a user typing ipconfig? Why is a user typing net user? Why is a user typing who am I? Those are all things that could be potentially areas for you to identify based off behavior, because why is Bob in sales trying to enumerate domain admin groups? That doesn't typically happen, right? Behavior versus commodity. And this doesn't just go for Windows. This also goes for OS X and Linux. I'll tell you, even a lot of the mature companies that we go against, their visibility in OS X and Mac and Linux are often pretty horrible. They usually don't have good detections there. So a lot of times when we're simulating an adversary, we go after those systems because they don't have the same or equal or anywhere near equal detection capabilities in those areas too. So those are areas that we need to focus on to ensure that we have centralization of logs and start to focus on that too. So wrapping things up, and then I'll get into some questions. Feel free to ask any questions that you have. There's a few different questions here that I already see. I'll get to those here in just a second. But when we talk about developing a plan, it's about understanding and validating that you have the consistent controls in place mapped to something that you can actually attest to, that is validating your program, your technical controls, whether it's preventative or detective, And that takes work, right? But it's not, that's the thing that we have to get out of, is that, this is work that we have to do to ensure that we're protecting our organization. That's like literally our whole function in security, is to validate and reduce our risk, that we are protected and that we're doing the right things to minimize the amount of damage an attacker can do. By implementing a product or a piece of technology does not reduce that risk. It introduces complexity, and you're hoping and you're praying and you're doing all those other things, doing seances, hoping that this technology is actually going to save you against an adversary or an attacker, when in most cases it is not. It's going to be a commodity or baseline amount of protection. And again, that's great. That's better than nothing, but it's not actual to your environment itself. So we need to be continuously testing our environments over and over and over again, with emulation and eventually simulation, which is an evolution of emulation, where you're actually simulating specific adversaries and trying to get around your detections. It's a different maturity level, and validating those and then building those detections over time. It might require you to write new detections or custom detections or enhance ones that you currently have. It's always a continual evolution of things that we're doing out there to make things better. And this is just, to me, this is probably the most important aspect of an information security program that I can emphasize to most organizations, because this is literally what will make or break your company. If you get targeted by an adversary, is your GRC program going to stop you? No. And by the way, I'm not just saying that we shouldn't have a GRC program or vulnerability management or all these different programs that make up. These are all services that build up your architecture, your foundation for your security program. So these are all important things to have in your organization. But ultimately, when you're being targeted by an adversary or an attacker, those programs aren't going to help you. They're past those programs. Those programs have failed you, and you have to have something in place to be able to respond. And it's not just about that initial entry point. Our focus has to be off of that initial entry point and what happens after an attacker gets access to your environment. That's ultimately what's going to shut those attackers down. That's what's going to minimize your damage, and that's what's going to keep you out of the news. And that takes time. That takes people. That takes an understanding of adversary landscape, and it's something that we have to be able to staff for in our organizations or use external parties for, to be able to get to a position to be able to do that. Companies rely too heavily off of the technology that they have from their trusted partners, and that's unfortunate, because those partners will let you down, because they're attending to the masses. They're attending to every organization that's out there. They're barely keeping the floodgates open. They have to build something that is consistent with every single organization out there, not just you. And that's ultimately where we're at today in security. It's literally the same problem that we had with antivirus in the 90s. We're signature-driven technology today based on crowdsourced telemetry data, and we have to get better at making it our own. Making it our own, we have a much better chance of surviving the types of attacks that we're seeing today, and that we're going to see continuously get worse. It's going to get worse. I hate to say this. I'm an optimist. I love everything. I think everything's great. I'm always a positive person, but I don't see this problem getting better anytime soon. I think we've made a lot of strides in security. I think we've made a lot of progress. I think the visibility that we have now at the board level, at our organizations, across the entire enterprise is substantially better than it ever has been. I think our strategy and our alignment is off when it comes to understanding that we can't just focus on making our organization a castle. We have to look at what happens once they're inside of our castle, and can we identify intruders once they're in there? And that's the mind shift that we have to look at, and saying, we have a lot of great controls in place. We're very good at our program, what we do, but we're going to fail. It's going to happen. There's a system that we didn't know about. There's a vulnerability we didn't know about. There's a person that clicked on something they shouldn't have. There's a password that was compromised in some location. There's a system we forgot about for multi-factor authentication. This is going to happen. We're going to make mistakes. And so in order for us to get better at that, we have to look at it post initial access and all those other phases that are out there to make this a much more defensible position than what we do today. So continual validation of those controls and making sure that we're doing better and building up on that, I think is the most important part. One last advice is if you can, establish a threat hunting team. I really view threat hunting as one of the largest and biggest missing links that we have in the cyclical effect of what we consider monitoring and detection. When you look at how do you continuously get better with understanding what adversaries are doing? Well, you have to have threat intelligence and understanding, other breaches that have occurred with other people and other aspects around where the industry is going, your research topics, and bring all that together with a team that can be able to look for those in your environment. Threat hunting is really, really, really important. It's going through the data going through your information, assuming that you're compromised, going through north to south, not just north to south, but east to west traffic, going through parent-child process relationships, going through command line arguments, going through service creations, going through registry entries, looking for that needle in the haystack that is a potential area of entry, but also that threat hunting team becomes a institutional knowledge or a pillar of information around what's happening in your environment and the types of attacks that are out there. And if you don't have that piece, how are you going to understand what the next attack is going to be, or what attackers are currently doing, or what this research is happening over here, or an evolution around Cobalt Strike, or whatever ends up happening? These are all areas that you have to have institutional knowledge in, or again, use a partner for those to be able to build those out in your environment so that you're continuously moving your program forward. It shouldn't stay here. It needs to move here, 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 and continuously move up, because that's where the progress and the pace of these other adversaries are going. But with that, I'll open up some questions here. Todd had a question. How does binary BDS shift from alert to block? I've seen BD do both. That's a good question. So it's from Todd. Todd, so when we're looking at things, we have automation that looks at suspicious activity. So for example, if we notice unusual parent-child process relationships that we identify as an attack chain, we just shut that process down. It kills it and shuts it down. But most specifically, if we have specific attacks that are going on, where let's just say the initial entry point where a user's compromised and they've got remote code execution onto a system, our SOC analysts are skilled to look at that and say, this is an actual attack, and they move those machines off of the network and they take action on behalf of the customer to minimize and contain those specific systems so that they no longer have access to the rest of the infrastructure. And that's ultimately what we're trying to accomplish, right? In any security operations center is to try to minimize the damage. So take that machine, it's compromised, move that off of the network so you no longer have a problem, so that it can't spread out to the rest of the system. And thus you are also shutting down, eliminating that attack, so that attacker no longer has command and control infrastructure to be able to do that. So there's definitely a balance between, hey, this is an annoyance or an attack that wasn't successful, to when there's actually an incident where we need to take action on. A good example would be the whole NotPetya instance with the Ukrainian or Russian malware software that we saw. We didn't require any update whatsoever. We saw that as soon as it hit, and we saw it start to move laterally across a couple of our customers. And what we started to do is shut those machines down instantaneously, because we knew that there was something going on there. We didn't know what it was. We knew it was bad, but we had to contain that incident as it went through. So it's definitely a balance of being able to identify threats, minimize those when certain things actually happen out there. We got a question from Dan. How does an organization baseline their PowerShell from scratch when most MS processes use PowerShell? Is there a way to know if something is safe because it already exists? That's a great question, Dan. So when you're looking at baselining PowerShell, there are going to be things that are going to be legitimate in your environment, and you're absolutely right. You shouldn't assume that it's legitimate already. There could be remnants, artifacts, or other adversaries that have been in there that you haven't detected before in the past. So when you're going through baselining activities, you want to look at the source and you want to investigate those scripts itself. So it's important to understand and to take a look at those scripts and to attribute them back to specific processes or business processes within the business itself or third-party applications that are being used. And that does take time to go through, right? Because you have to look at the script, you have to understand what it's doing. One of the things that you can do to shore those up very quickly is you can say, okay, is this being run from the context of a system account or a regular user account? You don't typically see PowerShell scripts being executed from regular user accounts, again, unless they're a specific business process from like a web developer or systems administrator, things like that. So you can whittle things down very quickly in that case and establish a baseline. But the broader sense of things of looking at PowerShell execution environment does take a little bit of time. There are other things you can do, like for example, Microsoft scripts are typically code signed, so you can validate code signing certificates. You can do other things to be able to restrict those. You can also look at execution paths of where it's coming from. Commonly abused attack paths are going to be in the syswile64 directory, which is 32 compatibility in the Windows 10 environment. That's typically used for process injection for native 32-bit shellcode compatibility. Those are going to be clear indicators that there's something wrong in your environment that you want to take a look at. So there are indicators that you definitely can look at in baseline, but it just takes some time to go through those for sure. Good question. Chris has a question. Good to see you, Chris, as well as Dan. Is there ways to build these custom events into existing MDR solutions so customers don't have to spend a tremendous amount of time customizing logging servers? Shouldn't those detections be part of MDR, EDR, XDR, whatever's next? Well, yeah, I agree. Whatever the next acronym is going to be, Chris. One thing I can say is that you're right. The problem that you run into in most EDR products is that they're very much focused on understanding, hey, we saw this attack here, we're going to build this specific type of detection in, versus baselining your environment, which is tough to do. I can say we definitely have a different approach over a binary. Our goal at binary is to have those detections, but also baseline your normal behavior of your environment itself too. So we're looking at your behavior, we're baselining your PowerShell commands, we're baselining your log bins. We build exceptions in for what are normal and what's not. We manage that as the service, and then we look for those deviations. So we're already doing that as part of the service itself. A great example is we have not had to make a behavior detection change in our product in over 4 years, and we've been able to detect literally every single major event that has occurred in those 4-year time periods because of the behavior detections. It doesn't mean that we detect the initial entry point, right? Like the exploitation method, like Hafnium, for example. We didn't know there was an exchange 0-day, very complex one that chained 6 different attacks in, but the post-exploitation side of that house where they dropped in web shells absolutely saw that, right? That's a behavior aspect. So you're right that the industry should move from a managed service perspective to that. The problem is that they're not. They're focused very much on those signature-driven TTPs or tactics, techniques, and procedures because it's easier to build those in from crowdsourced telemetry than it is to baseline organizations' environments. It's a very different approach. Our approach is very hard. It requires people, it requires understanding, it requires attack pattern recognition. It takes a lot of time and effort for us to go through those. It's the hardest way to do things, but it's the right way to do things. It's not the cheapest way to do things. It's the right way to do things. So we very much apply that as part of our service, but unfortunately, we don't see a lot of other folks do the same thing. But good question. Edwin had some here too. There is a book written where most intrusion chains have choke points where the attackers do not have many options, which is something defenders can improve rates of success. What's your viewpoints on this? Absolutely. When you talk about choke points or ways of being able to minimize attack surface, ultimately, it's a big buzzword in the industry, but zero trust models where you have minimization of architecture and infrastructure, where you're limiting things like lateral movement, for example, you become more of a service-based architecture versus a provider of all services. It is a much more difficult thing from an adversary to move to those different systems. So architecturally, you can absolutely design things to be much more resilient in these different fashions here. Moving to cloud infrastructure, for example, doesn't make you impervious to attack, but makes it more difficult. It also exposes a lot more information that you typically wouldn't have versus like an on-premise domain infrastructure versus something like Azure AD, where now an attacker has access to your entire Active Directory infrastructure remotely. So there are pros and cons to a lot of these, but what was definitely consistent and common between all of these is that if you can minimize your attack surface and you can reduce lateral movement from an attacker going from one machine to the next, you ultimately are making a big impact. Like just for example, just by enabling the Windows firewall and removing the ability for lower level protocols like SMB, RPC, or DCOM, those types of things from being used, you limit an attacker from being able to move from workstation to workstation to workstation to workstation. So now that attacker now has to move from workstation to server. And now hopefully that noise becomes a lot larger. Now if you start to build protections in place in your server infrastructure and you're not allowing full ports and protocols, you're allowing services like web applications, or you have VDI environments or things to that effect, now you've limited that even more. Now the attacker has to go even further and has to have a higher level of sophistication. So these can definitely make big, important design decisions in your architecture infrastructure that make it much more resilient to those types of attacks in the future for sure. So great question there, and appreciate that, Edwin. But I think that's all for the questions. And I just want to thank everybody today for coming on the talk to hear us talk about this. For me, this is one of my important topics that I really think a lot of organizations really need to focus on, because it's honestly what keeps me up at night, to be perfectly honest. And when we deal with incident responses, people get completely caught off guard. We had, a ransomware situation recently, the entire company was shut down. And unfortunately, they had to pay the ransom. There's nothing you can do about it. And again, clearly victims of these specific areas. And most companies just don't have the investment, the priority, and focus on these areas to make things better. And it's just, if you can focus on the detection capabilities, what you have, and expanding those different areas, you can make a much bigger impact on being able to ensure and attest that if you do get hit by these types of attacks, you're going to come out on the other side looking really good. But thanks again for everybody for coming today. If you have any questions, feel free to email us over at Binary Defense at any time, info@binarydefense.com. This session's recorded, so make sure all the slides and the session itself gets out to everybody. But really appreciate your time today, taking an hour out of your day to listen to me talk. And let's make defense a heck of a lot better. Let's kick these adversaries' butts, and let's turn this into an optimistic view to where we know that we're going to be able to come out of this much better than we started off with. So thanks again very much, everybody, and appreciate it.